Hello again. Thank you very much for staying with us. We will start now our next speaker. He will be talking about the defending broadcast networks and that hope is not a strategy. Please welcome the security advisor, Mr. Haroon Meer. Please.
Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. I'm not on the screen yet. So super quickly, we want to talk today about broadcast security. I'll go in a little bit on the angle that I'm hoping to take. But first, the clicker's not working. I want to introduce you to this gentleman, who's someone called Brian Snow. And he's the head of information assurance, or was, for the American NSA. And the reason why this is interesting is because a few years ago, Brian said this. He was talking at a conference in Malta, and he said that everyone needs to understand that your cyber systems function and work not because of the expertise of your technical or security staff, but solely due to the sufferance of your opponents. Okay, which basically means the only reason you haven't been attacked yet is because people haven't bothered attacking you. Okay, so it's a sobering thought, and it's one that I want us to start from. While we're talking about Brian, super quickly, I'll give you some background. I spent about 6 years building networks, building applications. Then I spent about a decade of my life just attacking stuff. So I worked in offensive cybersecurity, breaking into stuff, finding out how to break into stuff, and optimizing that. And since then, I've started working in defense again. And the logical question for you at this point is, so what? Why are you telling us this? The one reason is just so that you know that I'm not going to be as smooth a talker as Dr. Yasser or Muhammad earlier today. Okay, you should expect a little bit of roughness for my geekness. But more important than that, what you should understand is that I don't have a vested interest in making this sound worse than it is. Like, the only reason I'm speaking here today is to try to tell you, here's what it looks like for someone with an attacking point of view. Okay, in the past I've published on various things, but mainly the reason for why I do what I do, is to try to make sure that we're focusing on the right parts of the problem. And one of the surprising things that I'll tell you is that not everyone needs to care about security equally. Okay, one of the common things you get is everyone panics. Everyone thinks that security is the most important thing. But if you run a mom and pop shop, it probably doesn't matter. Like, you're terrified about your credit card getting stolen. That stuff's covered by the banks. Probably doesn't matter. So not everyone needs to worry about it. And an interesting thing, in South Africa, where I'm from, many years ago, they found out that whenever internet banking got hacked, everyone thought it was chaos for the bank. But internet banking users' numbers actually went up because people would report on internet banking in the news. And for the most part, people just remembered internet banking from the news. They didn't remember that it was internet banking that got hacked. And it turned out that any news was good news when you were in the banking business. And similarly, some people have recently started doing studies on whether stock prices are actually affected by breaches. So if you look up here, you'll see companies that were, in the last few years, breached. LinkedIn, Adobe, Target, Staples, Sony. And you'll see that stock price has no correlation whatsoever with whether or not there was public information about a breach. So it turns out that your stock price doesn't really matter. And for those of you who remember, a few years back, there was the fappening when Apple were hacked. People stole nude pictures of celebrities' phones. I'm not sure if you looked at Apple stock recently, hasn't exactly taken a hit. Snapchat, actually IPOing has been worse for them than the breach. But in general, again, to my point, not everyone needs to care. But what's interesting is, I think you guys need to care. And I'll talk a little bit about why this is, but for the most part, it's because I see you guys at the center of almost a perfect storm. Okay, there's 4 things that I'm going to talk on very briefly today on why I think security is going to matter so much for you guys. The first one, I'm not going to spend too much time on, but really simply, people who are living in broadcast for a long time were living in an island. Okay, it didn't matter if your stuff was insecure, you weren't exposed to everything else. Okay, so for the most part, you had an unlocked house, but your house was in a really safe neighborhood. Okay, and recently with convergence with TCP/IP, what's happening is your house is moving into a much worse neighborhood. Okay, and people who trace internet security on the internet or security breaches on the internet will go back and show you the spike that happened when Windows started shipping with TCP/IP. Okay, the moment Windows got a working TCP client built in WinSock, that's when attacks started happening. And this stuff is going to start happening more and more to broadcast. As broadcast joins IP and file-based stuff, you're going to start getting hit more. But the bigger problem for you guys is one of increasing complexity. For those of you who know, generally, when you're trying to defend stuff, and this is mainly for the vendors in the audience, the number of lines of code you have is almost an indicator of how many vulnerabilities you'll have in your code. Okay, because as humans, we haven't figured out how to write secure code yet. When Linux was first released, it had 10,000 lines of code in the kernel. Okay, today, more than 10,000 lines are committed to the Linux kernel every day. If the whole operating system, Linux, had 10,000 lines of code, today, just your web browser has something like 17 million lines of code. Okay, the amount of complexity is off the charts. Nobody can audit all of that code. Humans certainly can't. And your computers are different too. In the early 90s, when we started hacking on stuff, we'd try to hijack the processor on your computer. Today, your computer no longer has one processor. Some computers have 6. If you've got this MacBook and it's got this fancy LED strip, that's a computer all on its own. A few years back, a guy in Germany actually took a close look at modern hard drives. And he found that hard drives themselves are mini computers. You could literally run Linux on the hard drive because hard drives now have microprocessors on them. And it's not just hard drives, right? If any of you have plugged in using one of these VGA cables or video adapters, a few years back, guys from a crowd called Panic took a hacksaw to open one of these. And what they found was 2 gigs of RAM and a system on a chip. Okay, which literally means that this VGA adapter that you pay $100 for is actually a computer, like a full functioning computer. It's just one that's been programmed to move graphics around. Okay, and if you're talking about complexity and stuff that you know how to defend, I'll posit to you that your security guys don't have evil VGA adapters in their threat model. Okay, and to make matters worse, it turns out that every modern monitor actually has a working x86 computer in it. And like problems get worse and worse, and you get to the point where you just want to throw your hands up. A few years ago at a conference, again in Germany, 2 guys called Bunny and Zobs started looking at SD cards. Okay, so these tiny $1 SD cards, it turns out, are also tiny processors. Okay, so these tiny things are actually capable of computation, and because they're capable of computation, they can actually be hijacked and for all intents and purposes be made to be evil. So fully programmable, fully man-in-the-middleable, fully attackable. Now, the reason I bring up all this complexity again is because if you're running your security team with 2 guys on a shoestring budget, you're not even in this league, okay? Like this is not even a remote consideration for you. You're lucky if they're getting you to change your passwords, which comes up with this, right? And everyone knows, no matter what division you run, people complain that there's a shortage of people. But actually, in security, this turns out to be a pathological problem. Okay, so guys from Leviathan ran a survey over multiple years trying to look at security and the scarcity problem. And they ended up with a bunch of interesting conclusions, but one of them that stands out is that if every employee from GM, Costco, Home Depot, Delta, Procter & Gamble all became security experts overnight, there still wouldn't be enough security people to fill the need. Okay, so right now, just getting security people in the world is like finding hen's teeth. And to this, you've got one problem worse than that. And that's the only thing worse than not having security people is having bad security people. Because when you have bad security people, you think you're doing something about the problem, but most of the time what you're doing is just busy work. Okay, you have guys showing some activity, they're moving stuff around, but actually you're just getting more work as a result of it. As a tip, if you find you've got to do ridiculous security things, like if you're changing your password every 2 weeks and it needs special characters and hieroglyphics, chances are your guys are focusing on the wrong things. There's better things for them to do. And I had a lot in here to pick on our vendors in the crowd, but I lightened it. Something that's slightly interesting here. Before doing this talk, I went through to some of the broadcast systems, and I pulled binaries off them and started looking at them to see if they were doing the best-of-breed security practices that happen in the world today. So if you guys remember a few years ago, Microsoft were getting kicked all over the place. Like every second month, there was a big worm, made headlines, computers crashing all over the world. But at some point, that stopped. How did that stop? Why do you not get Microsoft worms anymore? Part of the reason is because Microsoft invested ridiculously heavily in application security. They invested ridiculously heavily in compiler optimization and protection to make sure that code wouldn't be as vulnerable anymore. Without taking names, I took a look at a whole bunch of software from vendors in the last week, and it turns out that only one of the 8 pieces of software that I looked at are opting into those modern security standards, which means, by and large, when it comes to broadcast security or the security of that code, we're in about 2001, 2002. The only reason we're not seeing worms in broadcast yet is because broadcast has been living in this isolated environment. As soon as that gets more exposure, it's going to get hit, and it's going to get hit ridiculously hard. If you're a vendor, you should be saying, but I know we've got a security team, and I know we do some of that security audit stuff. But I want you to ponder this. This is, from 2016, the Chrome security team. So Chrome, in 2016, had something like 32 people working full-time just on security, just on the Chrome web browser. Okay, because that's what it takes. Okay, if you're taking 2 or 3 people and you perform a pen test once or twice a year on your code, you're fooling yourself. Because with all of this effort thrown at it, Chrome still manages to find bugs. Okay, Chrome's still getting hacked periodically. The only reason you're not is because you're not facing that level of scrutiny yet. And of course, the question that comes up here is, well, maybe there's no motivated attackers. Okay, this is what keeps lots of people safe. The fact that nobody wants to take me out is the reason I'm not getting taken out. But if you're in the broadcast industry, I'll say that this clearly isn't true. This tweet was from last night. All of these French sites were down after a DDoS attack. Most of you will know about the attack that took TV5 Monde off the air. Okay, relatively simple attack that worked. And increasingly, you'll see from all different parts of the world increased aggression against broadcasters and the news media. You're seeing it come out of the States, and it's not really a new thing, right? Like everyone in Jazeera, I'm sure knows the story about the time when George Bush spoke about bombing Al Jazeera for its ongoing coverage of the Iraq stuff. Now, something to ponder is, it's clear that you've got these massively funded guys who are interested in being able to flick a switch and switch you off at some point. And with all that, I'm going to say it's going to get slightly worse. And the reason for that is this screenshot. Does anyone recognize what this is from? This is the Iranian president touring their nuclear facilities at Natanz. And the reason I've got it here is because a few years ago, almost everyone would have heard about Stuxnet. Okay, so Stuxnet turned out to be this computer virus/worm written by a combination of the USA and Israel, that effectively set the Iranian nuclear program back 3 years. Now, it's super cool, and there's lots of James Bond details, and if you're a geek, there's lots to be interested in. But I'm not talking about that. What should be your takeaway is that a superpower in the world wanted to get a result. They wanted to slow down Iran's nuclear enrichment, and they did it by using a cyber attack. Okay? And since then, it's become more common. Recently, talk of North Korean missile failures are also being attributed to cyber attacks. And if there's a part of you that says, well, it's okay because it's only these massive, super progressive governments that can figure it out, what you should know is that the Snowden leaks basically told the whole world, this is what you should be doing because this is what the other guys are doing. Now, whether you judge Snowden as a hero or as a traitor doesn't matter. What's important is that in a world post-Snowden, even really small countries and governments have figured out that there's massive leverage that they can get by investing in cyber attacks. It's why Russia and ISIS were able to attack and take down TV5 Mon. Because instead of hundreds and hundreds of thousands on a missile, like George Bush wanted to use, you can now pull it off fairly modestly with good hackers. And at this point, you should be saying, well, how do you expect us to compete with that? Like, it's one thing if you're asking us to fight garden variety hackers, but now you're asking us to fight against state-sponsored attacks, and that's just not fair. And the ray of hope is that it actually can be done relatively easily with just two important things. The one is a mindset shift. Okay, and this is something that's really hard for people to come to terms with. But you need to understand that your companies, your organizations, your software will be breached. It's not possible, it's completely impossible that you will not be breached. The NSA, who everyone thinks is 10 feet tall, didn't know that Snowden was hacking them till he was on a plane on his way to Hong Kong. Okay, you will be breached. The question is, how quickly do you react to it? And how do you contain it once that breach happens? And the second thing, and probably the most important thing, normally with security they say there's no silver bullet, but I'm telling you here, if there's one thing you take away from this talk, this is the one thing you should be taking away. Whenever people talk about going to RSA is this big security conference where people try to sell you stuff. This lady is the head of Chrome Security, and she made this tweet a little while back saying, listen, if you're planning on going and spending money at RSA, don't. Save your money, spend it on good people, and then actually listen to them. And that turns out to be surprisingly hard. And even if you think you're not that type of organization, I'm telling you, you are. Because, like, there's a very simple metric. If I showed you a blinky shiny box, and there are many on the market that sell for $1 million, that capture your attacks and let you know when it's happening, most of you go, $1 million, we can probably do that. If I told you, here's a guy, and he's probably the best guy you should get for this job, just pay him $1 million a year, almost everyone flinches. Because we're totally okay paying that for a silver box with lights on it, but totally not okay for paying that for a human who actually knows what he's doing. And that's got to shift. Because whenever people talk about security, they draw this triad and they'll tell you it's about people, process, and technology. And I'm telling you that's actually wrong. All it is about people. Because if you have the right people, they will put in the process and the technology to do what you need. And if you have the wrong people, all the process and technology in the world is not going to save you. What you need to do is find a way to find the right people and then find a way to keep them. So in conclusion, super quickly, for you guys, you need to consider the threat is super real. The broadcast industry has been protected almost by accident, because you guys were hidden on an island and you're not anymore. Breaches will happen. The important question is how you deal with them. And the only way you're going to dig your way out of this hole is if you can find good people, find a way to listen to them, find a way to take care of them. I think that's all I've got for today. If you guys have any questions, I think we've got time for questions. Other than that, you can hit me on Twitter and tell me why I'm stupid. Thank you very much.